Hello, my name is Mackenzie Wilcoxon, and my topic is over ethics and the military. The four key objectives of this presentation are to ensure you can identify key challenges and barriers for military transition, effective therapeutic practices, implications and applications in clinical psychology, and relevant principles and codes. The military environment consists of high-stakes situations, loyalty to one's unit and country, and quick, ethical decisions. In past years, psychological well-being has not been a priority in our society, and especially our U.S. military. However, physical injuries have always been a common and acceptable factor in the case of honorable discharge. However, what about the soldier who is now showing signs of Stockholm Syndrome, homicidal ideation, or psychosis because of the exposure to traumatic experiences? So, should they continue to be an active member of the military or be honorably discharged? Should psychological injury be considered equal to physical injury regarding required care? These are questions that we will consider later in the video. Before we dive into the information, a couple terms and acronyms to become familiar with are moral competence, moral injury, service member and/or veteran, and design research. Moral competence is recognizing and handling moral dilemmas. It also includes two sizable factors, which are autonomy and critical thinking. As for moral injury, it represents a construct that addresses dysphoric moral emotions or cognitions and maladaptive behavioral attempts to manage pain from moral violations. As for design research, we will discuss that in later slides. We will first start with moral competence. When considering different research studies, I wondered why moral competence was so prominent within the given research. Van Baarle provided 6 steps that can be used to gain moral competence. Number 1 was being aware of one's personal values and those of others. Number 2 is the ability to recognize the moral dimensions of a situation and identify which values are at stake or at risk of violation. The ability to adequately judge a moral issue or dilemma. Number 4 is the ability to communicate this judgment. Number 5 is the willingness and ability to act in accordance with this judgment in a morally responsible manner. Number 6 is the willingness and ability to be accountable to yourself and to others. So one way to utilize these steps is through the approach highlighted by Van Baarle in the next slide. The researchers encouraged ethical problem solving through design research, or DR. This approach is focused on testing different solutions for the given problem. There are 4 steps which include problem formulation, selection of evidence, design, intervention and evaluation, and reflection and learning. So an example of this is you need to decide who's going to be on your summer volleyball team, which is the problem formulation. Next is for selection of evidence. So you know 5 good friends who are great volleyball players, and as far as you know, they are not on a team. And next is design, intervention, and evaluation. So say that there's Sarah, who is an amazing setter, and then there's Leo, Allie, and Zoe, who are fantastic passers. Last is you and Milo, who are exceptional hitters. You ask each friend to be on your team and determine everyone's spots and techniques. Finally, there's reflection and learning. So you get to the end of the summer volleyball season, and then you're at the tournament, and you finish second. They were the right friends to choose, but you might use different techniques next time. So of course, this is a simple, uncomplicated example, but it is still very effective. So in the context of the military, moral competence can be difficult to apply when considering your own opinions in addition to others. However, by considering others' opinions, you are ingesting diverse thought processes and forming a solution that is the best outcome for all parties. In the article by Van Baarle, they utilize the DR in a support group setting. It served as more of an outline for support groups and sharing ethical dilemmas and how they were solved. This allowed for learning, reflection, and growth by everyone involved. Ethical problem solving is not a cookie-cutter strategy, but instead a fluid structure that can be adapted to different dilemmas. To further support the moral competence theory, Currier and colleagues' study stated that there is a relationship between potentially morally injurious events and mental health outcomes of service members and veterans. There are multiple ways to apply moral competence. Here, I will highlight the compliance-based model, which is currently being used by the military, and the value-based model. The compliance-based strategy is primarily focused on desired behavior without actively implementing training to transform the current behavior to the desired behavior. This is problematic because it does not adequately prepare military personnel or support them in handling ethical dilemmas. But there's value-based strategies, which are centralized around the reflection and understanding of one's values along with others. There is a sense of respect, responsibility, and empathy in relation to other individuals. This strategy is designed to encourage moral awareness, motivate compliance in employees and service members, and promote organizational values and norms. It is meant to be an active strategy, whereas compliance-based is passive. These approaches and models can be used in educational settings, leadership training, intervention, and group settings. Specifically in a military setting, although it may not be the quickest process, this approach could serve as a helpful tool to making a more ethical decision. As clinical psychologists, we can apply this information to clinical practice with active military members and veterans through providing insight into moral injuries, guilt, PTSD diagnoses, and military conflicts. The structure is meant to be used in a variety of settings, therefore making it a helpful intervention for those who are currently struggling and a valuable approach for training. Now we will discuss the challenges of military transition and barriers along with how it applies to the psychologist. The transition between soldier to civilian is immensely difficult. The outcomes of transitioning from the life of a soldier to a civilian can include post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use disorders, major depressive disorder, and suicide. This could be due to the identity that one finds in the military. A soldier must completely immerse themselves in the culture and values of the military until they are saturated in de-individuation, obedience, chain of command, and dissociation, all of which are opposite to the civilian world. This can lead to a lack of connection and increased isolation, discrimination, and marginalization during the transition. This can also be seen in the suicide rate. An average of 18 veterans per day die from suicide. Based on the results from 2022, the suicide rate will continue to increase over 32%. This is why we must consider factors such as moral injury, moral competence, relevant codes, relevant laws, and helpful therapeutic techniques. Collins and colleagues proposed the embedded mental health model, which provides mental health services within the unit. This model has been supported by lower stigma and higher access to care. As with all clients, it is important to build rapport between the therapist and the client to create a safe and healing environment. However, there could be barriers to prevent such relationships from forming. Two barriers are wait times and lack of privacy regarding records. Wait times can increase morbidity and suicide rates of individuals on active duty by 23% and the National Guard by 8.3%. The researchers' solutions to these problems are to train providers to be highly competent in their services for veterans and the military. Regarding the lack of privacy of records, soldiers might feel as though their superiors will treat them differently because of the information that their leaders can request. In the next section, we will also discuss the lack of competence. Moving on to therapeutic practices, it is important to review the required characteristics of an essential, uniformed mental health professional. They must be credible, accepted by service members, culturally competent, competent in military health problems, and finally possible treatments. They must be aware of the language used, such as acronyms and references that are central to the military's history and tradition, understand the different military ranks, responsibilities of that rank, and the issues that may come with the rank, and educate oneself on the history, traditions, and skills of the military and the structure of a military unit. Understanding the mission statement of the U.S. military system, which includes honor, courage, loyalty, integrity, and commitment, is also essential to being an effective mental health professional providing services to a service member or veteran. Whether an individual is an active soldier, a veteran, or a family member, it is important for clinical psychologists and other mental health professionals to gain proper training. As you saw from the introduction, there are many areas in which professionals must become more competent. Based on a study highlighted by Collins and colleagues, out of the 522 mental health professionals that participated, 34% received prior training in military cultural competencies. However, only 19% had high competency, while 70% worked with military population and 24% worked with TRICARE. Overall, only 23% met the requirements listed as high competency in military culture. It is believed that these results are due to the lack of fiscal resources, but I also wonder if it may be due to the lack of perceived necessity. So, let's consider a medical scenario. You broke your leg and are headed in for surgery. Your doctor looks nervous and panicked, so you ask if he is all right, and he says that he is completely fine. In turn, he asks if you are ready for your surgery. After the interaction you just had, you aren't so sure. It turns out the doctor was not competent in the medical procedure he was about to perform. In the same regard, as a serving member or veteran, don't you want your mental health professional to be competent, especially if they are about to perform services for you? A few things that would be helpful for a mental health professional to become familiar with are federal and state ethics codes, military instructions, military law, and mental health law. They need to become knowledgeable about resources including colleagues, organizations, support groups, hotlines, and other helpful tools. Healthcare systems must be mindful of multidimensional cultures and increase competency through education and adaptation. Ethical considerations should include confidentiality, multiple relationships, and multiple agencies. These factors include asking about current and past perspectives and experiences, different eras of war efforts, multicultural demographics, military culture, military jargon, barriers and mental health resources, and the psychologist's biases, attitudes, and beliefs toward the population. Several other factors include deployment cycles, relational stress such as partner and family, disconnection with military life and civilian life during transition, limits to confidentiality, stigma, sexual assault and harassment in the military, and utilizing different resources and organizations to support service members, veterans, and family members. Finally, service members and veterans' mixed feelings of seeking help, exposure to trauma and re-traumatization, along with sexual orientation biases, sexism, racism, transgenderism, discrimination against treatments, interventions, assessments in the LGBT plus community, homelessness, substance abuse, incarceration, and disabilities must be thoughtfully examined. Ethical considerations should include multiple relationships, multiple agencies, and confidentiality. The individual utilizing services may be fearful of the mental health professional reporting to superiors or even providing insight that could result in dismissal from the military. It is possible that the therapist could also hold an officer role, creating multiple relationships with the individual. Finally, the psychologist must be aware of who the client is and the objective. If the psychologist's job is to provide an assessment of an individual, who is the client? It is most likely the organization. Confidentiality must be highlighted in the informed consent due to request for information. Although I am not familiar with the release of information regarding the military, as stated before, the mental health professional should know the limitations at a federal and state level. How are we to apply this information to clinical psychology? In application, when discussing past trauma with a client, it is important to take moral injury into consideration. Veterans or those in active duty may commit or witness acts that are contradictory to their beliefs or values. This can result in moral injury, which may also be associated with mental health outcomes. 25% of service members and/or veterans perpetrated, witnessed, and/or were victims of others' acts of perceived moral wrongdoing. It would be helpful to educate those who are on active duty in ethical problem solving so our military can run with confidence instead of crawling with trauma and regret. For our last section, we will be discussing principles and codes. We will first discuss Principle E, which is respect for people's rights and dignity. Depending on the age and era of veterans, it is important to maintain a person's dignity, some more than others. It is important that although one may be impaired physically or mentally, they still maintain autonomy, confidentiality, and a right to self-determination. It is important that individuals be respected based on their age, gender identity, race, ethnicity, culture, national origin, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, disability, language, and religion. It is also a requirement for psychologists to eliminate any biases they may have against the given population and/or systems. Psychologists should always be reflecting on their own beliefs so as not to interfere with the therapeutic process or relationship, such as countertransference. All stated criteria for the principle align with the factors and requirements one must consider to be an effective clinical psychologist working with individuals who are in the military. Next is Code 201. This code supports the need for training and interventions to ensure that those who are providing psychological services are competent. They must be competent in training, supervision, education, consultation, professional study, and therapeutic experience. They must also be able to adapt to each individual's needs and diverse background while also challenging any biases they may have. Clinical psychologists should consider all possible avenues of becoming competent before referral or termination, which is stated in Code 1010. Finally, there is Code 307. This code covers the instance in which an active member may be required by the organization, for example, Department of Defense, to seek therapy. In this case, it is important to clarify the role of the client. A couple things to consider are who is entitled to the individual's information and the limitations of confidentiality. If information is requested and obtained by the organization, the role of the therapist, the responsibilities, and who they are responsible for reporting to should be clarified. For my concluding statements, I would like to address the questions in my introduction. What about the soldier who is now showing signs of Stockholm Syndrome, homicidal ideation, or psychosis because of the exposure to traumatic experiences? Should they continue to be an active member of the military? Should psychological injury be considered equal to physical injury regarding required care? To answer these questions, empathy is essential. We must step inside the service member and veteran's shoes to see from their perspective. I would not want to be forced, belittled, invalidated, or ostracized because of the need for mental health resources. This need is just as dire as physical injury, and if it goes untreated, the consequences could be catastrophic. We owe it to those who serve our country to become competent in training, knowledgeable in military information and history, and familiar with the military system as a whole. It is also important to understand the values, beliefs, and mission statement of the military that includes honor, courage, loyalty, integrity, and commitment. Ultimately, my focus is not on honorable discharge in relation to psychological well-being, although it is important to consider. My call to action lies with training and competence. It is important to provide the best care for any and all populations who need it. We owe it to our clients to become competent, especially if we are working with a specific population. I know at this point I probably sound like a broken record, but this is to serve as encouragement for clinical psychologists to seek further training, not only for themselves, but for the clients who deserve competent mental health professionals. Thank you for listening, and here are my references.